You won't admit it to anyone, but sometimes you catch yourself lying. Not about anything important. Just small edits to your weekend plans when a coworker asks what you're up to. A strategic exaggeration about being busy when someone suggests getting together. The careful construction of a life that sounds full enough that no one asks the question you're terrified they'll ask. Because the truth is simpler and more complicated than you want to say out loud. You don't really have friends. Not anymore. Maybe not ever, in the way other people seem to. And here's what makes this particularly painful from a psychological perspective. We live in a culture that has turned friendship into a moral litmus test. If you don't have friends, something must be wrong with you. You're damaged, antisocial, a failure at the most basic human task. The isolation itself becomes a source of shame, which creates more isolation, which deepens the shame. It's a psychological spiral that Jung would recognize immediately as a complex, a self-reinforcing pattern that takes on a life of its own in the psyche. But what if the psychology of friendlessness is far more nuanced than our culture allows? What if the absence of conventional friendship sometimes reveals not pathology, but a particular relationship with the collective, with the self, with the very process of individuation? Before the end of this exploration, we'll examine how the psyche navigates the space between connection and solitude, why some people find themselves perpetually on the outside, and what becomes visible when you stop treating friendlessness as a problem to be solved and start seeing it as a psychological position worth understanding. Welcome to Deep
Psyche Lab,
where we explore the hidden territories of the human psyche through the lens of Carl Jung's depth psychology. I'm so glad you're here for this conversation because this is one of those topics we collectively avoid, even as it shapes millions of lives behind closed doors. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. We go deep into the psychological patterns that conventional psychology often overlooks. And every video is designed to shift how you see yourself and others. This isn't about quick fixes or social skills training. This is about understanding the psyche itself. So let's begin where most discussions of friendlessness refuse to go, into the actual texture of that experience, and what it reveals about how consciousness relates to the collective. There's a moment that people without friends know intimately. You're scrolling through social media and you see photographs of birthday parties you weren't invited to, weekend trips taken by people who never thought to include you, inside jokes forming in comment threads you'll never be part of. And what strikes you isn't just the exclusion. It's how effortless connection seems for everyone else. They move through the social world like it has a logic you were never taught, a language you don't quite speak. You watch them form bonds that appear spontaneous, natural, easy. And you wonder what's missing in you that makes this impossibly hard. Jung would point us toward something crucial here. The psyche doesn't experience isolation neutrally. It interprets it through archetypal lenses, through ancient patterns of meaning that predate individual experience. When you find yourself without friends, you're not just dealing with a social circumstance. You're contending with the archetype of the exile, the outcast, the one who stands outside the tribe. This is primal territory. For most of human history, exclusion from the group meant death. The psyche still carries that knowledge. Friendlessness activates something ancient and terrifying. Even when your physical survival isn't actually threatened. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Not everyone who lacks friends experiences this as exile. Some people occupy what we might call the hermit position instead. The hermit and the exile look similar from the outside. Both are alone. Both stand apart from conventional social bonds. But psychologically, they're inhabiting a completely different relationship to that solitude. The exile wants in and can't find the door. The hermit has found something in solitude worth protecting. The exile's isolation is enforced by factors they don't understand or can't control. The hermit's solitude is chosen, even if that choice isn't always conscious. Jung himself knew both positions intimately. After his break with Freud, he entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he withdrew from his professional circle, from the psychoanalytic community that had defined his identity. He spent long stretches essentially friendless, working with the images and figures that rose from his own depths. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. From the outside, he looked isolated, cut off, lost. But Jung was doing something else entirely. He was learning to relate to the objective psyche, to the autonomous contents of the unconscious. His friendlessness wasn't pathology. It was individuation. Now, we need to be careful here. I'm not suggesting that all friendlessness is secretly individuation in disguise. That would be a dangerous romanticization. But Jung's experience points us towards something essential. The psyche sometimes requires periods of isolation for development to occur. There are phases of psychological growth that can't happen in the constant presence of others, because the collective's expectations. The need to maintain the persona, the sheer noise of social interaction, drowns out the quieter voices that need to be heard. Think about the fairy tale of Iron John, which Robert Bly explored so beautifully. The young prince must descend to the bottom of the pond, must spend time in the wild man's forest, must work in disguise in the king's kitchen. These are all periods of isolation, of being cut off from his former identity and relationships. The development he undergoes there in that aloneness is what makes his eventual return to the collective meaningful. He couldn't have become himself without that. It's time outside. But most people experiencing friendlessness aren't thinking in terms of fairy tales or individuation. They're thinking they're broken. And this is where the real psychological damage occurs. Not in the friendlessness itself, but in the meaning we assign to it. Our culture has created what Jung would call a collective complex around social connection. A complex is a feeling tone node in the psyche, an area where emotion clusters around certain ideas or experiences and takes on autonomous power. The cultural complex around friendship says that having lots of friends equals psychological health, social skills, likability, worth. Not having friends equals the opposite. Damaged, deficient, less than human. When you're caught in this complex, you can't see friendlessness clearly. You can only see it through the distorting lens of shame, and shame, psychologically speaking, is the emotion that says, something is fundamentally wrong with my being. Not I did something bad, which is guilt, but I am bad. Shame attacks identity itself. When friendlessness gets bound up with shame, it becomes almost impossible to examine it honestly. Every attempt to look at it directly triggers the shame response, which makes you want to look away, to defend, to construct elaborate justifications, or sink into hopeless self-blame. Neither response leads to actual understanding. So let's try to look at this without the shame. What are the actual psychological mechanisms that lead to friendlessness? Not the moral judgment, not the cultural story, but the patterns in the psyche that result in a person standing outside the bonds of conventional friendship. One pattern Jung would recognize immediately is the problem of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear in social situations, the version of ourselves we present to meet collective expectations. Everyone has a persona. It's necessary for functioning in the world. But some people develop what we might call a rigid or inadequate persona. The rigid persona is overdeveloped, so controlled and defended that no genuine human warmth can flow through it. You meet someone like this and they seem fine. They say all the right things, but there's something missing. You can't feel them. There's no texture, no vulnerability, no real presence. The rigid persona protects against genuine encounter, which means it protects against friendship. The inadequate persona is different. This is someone who never quite learned how to wear the social mask convincingly. They say the wrong thing, miss social cues, can't read the room. Not because they're unintelligent, but because the persona never properly formed. Every social interaction feels like a test they're failing, a performance they can't quite pull off. They're too visible, too raw, without the protective coloring that makes social navigation smooth. Both patterns lead to friendlessness, but for opposite reasons. The rigid persona is too defended. The inadequate persona isn't defended enough. And here's what's psychologically tragic about both. Neither allows for the kind of genuine encounter where friendship becomes possible. Friendship, real friendship, requires what Jung called participation mystique, a partial dissolution of ego boundaries, a momentary fusion where you and another person occupy shared psychological space. You can't get there through rigid defense. You can't sustain it without enough structure to hold the connection. But there's another pattern, and this one runs deeper. Jung talked about complexes, those autonomous fragments of the psyche that carry their own charge. their own agenda. Some people carry complexes that actively sabotage connection. The abandonment complex, for instance. If early experience taught the psyche that connection equals abandonment, that letting someone close means eventually being left, then the psyche will unconsciously arrange things to avoid that pain. It will choose isolation over the risk of loss. Better to be alone by choice than abandoned by circumstance. The complex runs the show without conscious awareness, creating a kind of force field that keeps people at a distance. Or consider the inferiority complex, which Alfred Adler emphasized but which Jung also recognized. When you carry a deep sense of being fundamentally less than others, friendship becomes psychologically impossible. Not because you're actually inferior, but because the complex won't let you believe anyone would genuinely want you. Every friendly gesture gets interpreted as pity. Every inclusion feels like charity. You can't receive connection authentically when the complex tells you that you don't deserve it, so you reject it before it can reject you. The isolation that follows looks like friendlessness, but it's actually the complex protecting itself. Now, Jung was always interested in the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we can't acknowledge, that we split off and refuse to see. And friendlessness has its own shadow dynamics that rarely get discussed. Sometimes the person without friends is carrying shadow material that the collective can sense but can't name. They're holding rage or envy or a kind of aggressive neediness that leaks out in ways they don't intend. Other people pick up on it instinctively and pull back. Not consciously, usually. They just find themselves making excuses, creating distance, feeling vaguely uncomfortable without knowing why. This is delicate psychological territory, because it's easy to slide into blame. But Jung's point about the shadow isn't about blame. It's about consciousness. The shadow material is unconscious. You can't integrate what you can't see. And when you're friendless, one of the most useful questions you can ask is not, "What's wrong with me?" but "What am I carrying that I can't see? What aspect of my psychology is so unacceptable to my conscious mind that it has to operate in darkness, where it sabotages the very connection I claim to want?" Sometimes the shadow around friendlessness is even more paradoxical. Sometimes the reason a person has no friends is because they actually don't want friends, but they can't admit this to themselves. Our culture places such moral weight on friendship that wanting solitude, preferring your own company, finding social interaction draining rather than energizing, all of this gets pushed into shadow. You end up in this strange psychological position where you're trying desperately to make friends because you think you should, while unconsciously sabotaging every attempt because you don't actually want what you're pursuing. The psyche is working at cross purposes with itself. Jung would ask us to consider whether this might actually be the self trying to redirect the ego toward a different path. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that has its own intelligence, its own direction. Sometimes what looks like failure from the ego's perspective, from the conscious mind's agenda, is actually the self saying, "This isn't your path. Stop trying to fit into a mold that isn't yours." If you're finding value in this exploration, this perspective is opening something up for you, consider liking this video. It helps more people find these ideas, and it tells me that going deep into these uncomfortable territories is worthwhile. And of course, subscribing to Deep Psyche Lab means you'll be here for every new exploration of the psyche's hidden patterns. Let me take you deeper into the archetypal dimension of this, because this is where Jung's work becomes most illuminating. There's a Greek myth that rarely gets discussed, but that speaks directly to the psychology of friendlessness. The story of Philoctetes. He was one of the greatest archers in Greece, a warrior destined to fight at Troy. But on the way to battle, he was bitten by a snake on a sacred island. The wound wouldn't heal. It festered, became grotesquely infected, emitted a terrible smell. And because the wound was so repulsive, because his cries of pain were so disturbing to the other warriors, they abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. For 10 years, he lived alone, in constant agony, with only his bow for survival. The wound made him unbearable to others. The isolation was enforced by his condition. And here's what makes this myth psychologically profound. Philoctetes wasn't abandoned because he was weak or useless. He possessed the bow of Heracles, the weapon that would be essential for winning the war at Troy. The Greeks needed him, but they couldn't stand to be near him. So they left him alone with his wound and his power, exiled from the collective that would eventually have to come back and beg for his help. This is the psychology of many people without friends. Not that they're literally wounded, but that they carry something the collective finds unbearable. It might be too much intensity, too much feeling, too much truth-telling. It might be a refusal to play the social games that keep everything smooth. It might be trauma that hasn't been processed, grief that hasn't been metabolized, anger that hasn't found appropriate expression. Whatever it is, it creates a kind of psychic smell that makes others uncomfortable. Not because the person is bad or wrong, but because what they carry challenges the collective's defenses, threatens its comfortable agreements about what gets acknowledged and what gets ignored. And like Philoctetes, these people often possess something valuable precisely because of their isolation. Time alone, time outside the collective's influence, allows for the development of capacities that can't form in constant social engagement. Jung saw this in his own work. The insights he brought back from his years of isolation, his confrontation with the unconscious. These became the foundation of depth psychology. He couldn't have discovered them while maintaining his social connections in the psychoanalytic community. The isolation was the condition of the discovery. But let's not romanticize the suffering. Philoctetes was in agony. His abandonment was genuine trauma. The fact that it eventually led to his return to Troy, to his essential role in winning the war, doesn't erase the pain of those 10 years alone. And for people without friends, the fact that isolation might be serving some deeper psychological process doesn't make it hurt any less. The human animal is wired for connection. Mirror neurons fire when we see others experiencing emotion. The nervous system regulates itself through co-regulation with other nervous systems. We're not meant to be alone all the time. The psyche knows this. Even when circumstances require solitude, so we're dealing with a genuine paradox here. And Jung loved paradoxes because he understood that the psyche operates through them. Individuation requires separation from the collective, but humans need connection to thrive. Some periods of isolation serve psychological development, but chronic loneliness damages both psyche and soma. The person without friends might be undergoing essential inner work, or they might be trapped in patterns that prevent genuine encounter. Both can be true. The psyche is large enough to hold these contradictions. What matters, from a Jungian perspective, is consciousness. Are you aware of what's actually happening psychologically? Can you distinguish between the hermit phase and the exile position? Do you know what complexes are operating? What shadow material is active? What persona problems might be interfering with connection? Or are you just suffering without understanding, caught in shame that prevents you from seeing clearly? Let's look at another archetypal pattern that illuminates this. Jung talked extensively about the pure eterness, the eternal youth, and its feminine counterpart, the puella eterna. These are people who never quite land in life, who remain in a state of perpetual potential, always on the verge of really beginning but never quite arriving. The pure puella often has difficulty forming lasting friendships because friendship requires commitment, reliability, showing up consistently over time. But the eternal youth is always moving, always seeking the next possibility, the new beginning that will finally be the right one. There's a quality of ghostliness to the pure's relationships. They're charming, fascinating even, but you can't quite hold on to them. They slip away just as you think you're getting close. Not out of malice, but because landing an actual relationship would mean accepting limitation, accepting the reality of who they are rather than the potential of who they might become. And the pure can't do that. So they drift, perpetually alone, even when surrounded by people, never forming the roots that friendship requires. From the outside, this looks like an inability to make friends. But psychologically, it's more complex. It's a refusal to incarnate fully, to accept the weight and limitation of actual embodied existence. Friendship is embodied. It happens in real time, in physical space, with all the messinnesses and compromise that entails. The pure is allergic to this. They want connection but can't bear its demands. So they end up friendless, but not because they lack social skills. Because they're in flight from the very conditions that make friendship possible. The psychological task here isn't learning how to make friends. It's landing. Accepting gravity. Letting yourself become who you actually are, rather than clinging to who you might become. This is painful work because it means accepting limitation. Accepting that you're not infinite potential, but a specific person with specific qualities and specific constraints. But it's only through this acceptance that real relationship becomes possible. The pure has to die for the person to live. And sometimes friendlessness is the psyche's way of forcing that death, that transformation now. There's another dimension we need to examine. And it touches on what Jung called the anima and animus, the contrasexual elements of the psyche. In Jungian psychology, the anima is the unconscious feminine in a man, the animus, the unconscious masculine in a woman. These are complex, multifaceted concepts, but one of their functions is to mediate relationship. The anima, animus, is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world, between the ego and the unconscious, between self and other. When the anima or animus is poorly developed or operating problematically, connection becomes difficult. Jung talked about negative animus possession, where a woman becomes rigid, opinionated, harsh in a way that isn't authentic to her actual nature, but reflects an unconscious masculine complex. Or negative anima, where a man becomes moody, overly sensitive, taking everything personally, lost in feeling states that overwhelm rather than inform. Both patterns make friendship almost impossible, because the person isn't relating from their actual self, but from a distorted, autonomous complex. What does this look like concretely? The man caught in negative anima might find that every friendship eventually becomes a drama. Small slights become major betrayals. Disagreements escalate into emotional storms. He needs constant reassurance, constant validation, but nothing anyone offers is ever quite enough. Friends eventually exhaust themselves trying to maintain the relationship and pull back. He's left alone, feeling abandoned, not recognizing that the anima complex is orchestrating the very abandonment it fears. Or the woman in animus possession might approach friendship with a kind of intellectual superiority, always correcting, always knowing better, unable to meet people where they are. She doesn't mean to be dismissive. She's identified with a masculine mode of relating that values argument over empathy, being right over being close. Other women find her exhausting. Men find her threatening. She ends up isolated, wondering why no one can handle her strength. It's not seeing that strength without relatedness isn't strength at all. It's defense. The work here is becoming conscious of these complexes, seeing how they operate, learning to relate not from the complex but from the ego in right relationship with the anima or animus. This is advanced psychological work. It requires honesty, self-observation, often the help of someone who can see what you can't see. But it's the only way out of the patterns that create chronic friendlessness. Jung also emphasized that psychological development isn't linear. It doesn't move in a straight line from less developed to more developed. It moves in spirals, in cycles, through phases of expansion and contraction. There are times in life when the psyche naturally pulls inward, when relationship takes a back seat to inner work. Adolescence is one such time. The famous tendency of teenagers to withdraw into their rooms, into themselves. Midlife is another, when the questions that animated the first half of life stop working and new questions haven't yet formed. These are liminal times, times between. And they often require a degree of solitude that looks like friendlessness from the outside. The mistake is treating these natural psychological rhythms as pathology. If you're in a phase of contraction, of turning inward, and you force yourself to maintain a social life that feels false, you're working against the psyche's natural movement. You end up exhausted, resentful, going through the motions of friendship without the animating spirit that makes it real. Better to honor the contraction, to let yourself be alone when alone is what's needed, trusting that the cycle will eventually swing back toward expansion, toward the world, toward connection. But here's the shadow side of this. It's easy to use psychological development as a rationalization for patterns that are actually just fear. I don't have friends because I'm individuating can be a genuine insight or a sophisticated defense mechanism. How do you tell the difference? Jung would say, you have to look at the fruits. Is your solitude generative? Is something actually developing in you? Are you engaging with the unconscious through active imagination, dream work, creative expression? Or are you just isolated, binge-watching shows, scrolling social media, feeling vaguely depressed and calling it introversion? The hermit is engaged in something. The exile is just cut off. The hermit has chosen a relationship with solitude that feeds the soul. The exile is suffering an absence they don't understand. Both might look friendless, but psychologically they're in completely different territory. And the crucial thing is being honest about which one you're actually experiencing. There's a particular pain to friendlessness that we haven't quite named yet. It's not just loneliness, though that's part of it. It's a kind of ontological doubt. When no one chooses you, when no one sees you as worthy of their time and attention and care, you start to wonder if you're real. Other people's recognition confirms our existence. We know we matter because other people treat us as if we matter. When that recognition is absent, when you move through the world largely unseen, a strange thing happens to the psyche. You start to feel ghostly, insubstantial, like you might disappear entirely and no one would notice. Jung understood this through his concept of participation mystique, that primitive state where identity is bound up with the collective, where you don't fully exist as a separate self. Most of us move beyond this in childhood, developing an ego that can stand apart from the group, but we never entirely leave it behind. We still need the collective's recognition at some level. We still confirm our reality through others' eyes. When friendlessness is chronic, when you go months or years with no one really seeing you, it activates that primal fear of dissolution, of ceasing to exist. This is why friendlessness isn't just a social problem. It's an existential one. It threatens the very foundation of selfhood. And the psyche will do almost anything to avoid that threat, including constructing elaborate fantasy relationships, becoming obsessed with celebrities or influencers who feel like friends, creating online personas that receive the recognition the actual person doesn't. These aren't pathological. They're survival strategies. The psyche is trying to confirm its own existence in whatever way it can. But there's another response to chronic friendlessness that's more psychologically interesting. Some people stop looking to others for confirmation and start developing a relationship with what Jung called the self, not the ego. Not the conscious personality, but that deeper center of the psyche that exists beyond the personal. This is what Jung was doing during his years of isolation. He was learning to relate to the objective psyche, to experience himself as part of something larger than the personal ego, something that didn't need external validation because it was rooted in the archetypal, the collective unconscious, the transpersonal dimension of existence. This sounds mystical. And it is, but it's also psychologically practical. When your sense of reality and value comes from within, from your connection to the self, you're less dependent on external recognition. Not independent of it, we're never that, but less consumed by its absence. You can be alone without dissolving into nothingness. You can lack conventional friendships without losing your sense of being a person who matters. But let's be clear. This isn't a path for everyone, and it's not a path anyone should have to take. It's what some people discover when other options close. It's what happens when the psyche is forced to find resources within because the external world offers so little. There's a cost to this kind of development. You become strange to yourself and to others. You see things differently. You can't quite fit back into conventional ways of being. The friendlessness that drove you inward becomes reinforced by what you discovered there. So what changes when you become conscious of these patterns? When you stop seeing friendlessness as simple failure and start seeing it as a psychological position with its own logic, its own meaning. First, the shame lifts, at least partially. You stop being so identified with the cultural story that says you're defective. You can look at your situation with some curiosity, some compassion even. Why is this my experience? What am I learning here? What's trying to develop? Second, you gain some agency. When friendlessness is just happening to you, when you're its victim, you're powerless. But when you understand the psychological mechanisms at play, the complexes, the persona problems, the archetypal patterns, you have something to work with. You can engage with these patterns consciously, not to fix yourself necessarily, but to understand yourself. To see where you're operating from wound and where you're operating from depth. Third, you stop forcing. If your psyche is in a hermit phase, if the self is directing you toward solitude for reasons that will only become clear later, trying to manufacture friendships as violence against your own nature, you can relax into what is, can trust that the psyche knows what it's doing, even when the ego doesn't understand. This doesn't mean resigning yourself to permanent isolation. It means honoring the psychological season you're in. But here's what consciousness also reveals. Sometimes the patterns creating friendlessness are just patterns. They're not serving anything. They're remnants of old wounds, old adaptations that outlived their usefulness. The rigid persona that once protected you now imprisons you. The complex that once made sense of early experience now distorts current reality. And in these cases, consciousness creates the possibility of change. Not through willpower, not through forcing yourself to be more social, but through the slow work of integration, of bringing shadow into light, of developing a more authentic persona, of loosening the complex's grip. Jung talked about active imagination as a core technique for this work. You dialogue with the autonomous contents of the psyche. You give them voice and form. You engage with them until they transform. If you have an inferiority complex that sabotages connection, you can imagine it as a figure, a character. You can ask it questions. Where did you come from? What are you protecting? What would you need to relax your hold? This isn't just fantasy. It's how you work with the psyche at the level where it actually operates. At the level of image and feeling rather than concept and analysis. Or you might work with dreams. Everyone dreams, whether they remember them or not. And dreams are the psyche's natural commentary on waking life. If you're friendless and you start paying attention to your dreams, patterns will emerge. Maybe you dream repeatedly of being locked out of houses, unable to find the key. Maybe you dream of crowds where everyone speaks a language you don't understand. Maybe you dream of being invisible, walking through scenes where no one sees you. These aren't random. They're showing you the psychological situation from the unconscious perspective, and working with them, unpacking their symbols, following their logic. This reveals a dimension of the problem you can't see consciously. The point isn't to solve friendlessness. Jung wasn't interested in solutions in that sense. He was interested in understanding, in consciousness, in bringing what was unconscious into awareness where it could be integrated. Sometimes that leads to change in external circumstances. Sometimes it doesn't. But it always leads to a different relationship with those circumstances. A relationship that includes understanding rather than just pain. Let me offer you something to sit with as we come toward the close of this exploration. 3 questions you might ask yourself, not to answer immediately, but to live with, to let work on you. First, is my friendlessness something being done to me, or something my psyche is orchestrating for reasons I don't yet understand? Second, what do I actually want from friendship versus what I think I should want? And third, what aspects of myself have I had to reject or hide in order to pursue connection? And what would happen if I stopped doing that? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they point toward the kind of self-examination that makes psychological development possible. They shift you from being a passive victim of circumstance to being an active participant in your own psychological life. And here's the deepest thing I can tell you about the psychology of friendlessness. Sometimes the person without friends is the person who refuses to betray themselves for belonging. Sometimes isolation is the price of integrity, of not pretending to be someone you're not, of not laughing at jokes you don't find funny, or agreeing with opinions you don't share, or performing a version of yourself that makes others comfortable. Sometimes friendlessness is what happens when you choose truth over accommodation. Our culture treats this as failure, but Jung would recognize it as the beginning of individuation. That lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the collective needs you to be. It's painful. It's costly. You lose things you genuinely wanted, connections you genuinely valued. But you gain something too, You gain yourself. You gain the possibility of relationships that are built on who you actually are, rather than who you're pretending to be. Those relationships are rarer. They take longer to form. But when they happen, they touch something real. This exploration of depth psychology is not a substitute for professional therapy. And I want to be clear about that. If friendlessness is causing you significant distress, if it's combined with depression or anxiety or thoughts of self-harm, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional. What we're doing here is psychological education, not treatment. But what I hope this exploration has given you is a different lens. A way of seeing friendlessness that includes complexity, that honors the psyche's autonomy. That doesn't reduce you to a problem needing fixing. You're a person navigating the intricate relationship between self and other, between individuation and belonging, between what you want and what's actually possible at this stage of your psychological development. You are not broken. You are not fundamentally defective. You are a human being engaged in the eternal human struggle to find your place between solitude and connection, between authenticity and relationship, between who you are alone and who you become with others. That struggle is the work of a lifetime. Having or not having friends at any particular moment is just one chapter in a much longer story, and you don't yet know how that story ends. If this exploration resonated with you, if you found something here that shifted your perspective even slightly, I invite you to share one word in the comments that captures where you are in this journey right now. Just one word: hermit, exile, becoming, searching, awake, whatever feels true. And if you want to go deeper into these psychological territories, subscribe to Deep Psyche Lab and hit that notification bell. Every video we create is designed to help you see yourself and your inner life with new eyes. That's the work. That's what matters. Thank you for going this deep with me. The psyche is vast, and you're brave for exploring its more uncomfortable territories. I'll see you in the next exploration. The loneliness isn't the wound, it's the alarm, telling you something in the psyche demands to be seen.